Good morning. We're in week 5 of our present series on the I am sayings of Jesus found in the Gospel of John. So far we have reflected on the sayings of Jesus. I am the bread of life. If anyone comes to me, he will never be hungry. Jesus was saying that he was the one who satisfies fully. I am the light of the world, the one who has come to bring light into our darkness. I am the gate for the sheep, not a gate, but the gate, the one and only. There is no other. Whoever enters through me will be saved, says Jesus. I am the good shepherd. I am the one who lays down my life for the sheep. If you've not heard any of the previous talks and you want to listen to them, or listen to them again if you've heard them previously, then they're all available on our YouTube channel, Tamworth Elim Church Online. This morning we're going to focus our thoughts on the 5th of the I am sayings. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Now let's pick up the story in John chapter 11. And let's walk through this story together. John first of all tells us that Jesus was with his disciples when a messenger came to tell Jesus that their friend Lazarus, brother of Mary and Martha, was sick. Although we are not told directly, this message was probably a request for Jesus to go to Lazarus. But he didn't go. Rather, as John records, when he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." And then John adds an interesting comment. He says, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, yet he heard that Lazarus was sick. He stayed where he was 2 more days. Now John obviously thinks that point is noteworthy. That's why he's included it in his gospel. He seems incredulous over Jesus' decision to delay going to his friend Lazarus. Jesus loved Martha and Mary and Lazarus, and yet he didn't do the one thing that everybody thought that he should do. That is, stop what he was doing, travel to the village of Bethany, and be with his friends in their time of need. I sometimes find Jesus quite surprising too. He doesn't always say or do what I think that he should say or do. And we are told that Jesus waited a further 2 days before travelling. Then a few verses later we read, on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. This little detail might give us the reason why Jesus didn't just pack his bags and travel to visit Lazarus when he first heard the message. Think about it this way. The messenger would have taken a day to get to Jesus. Jesus waited a further 2 days before travelling. Then it took Jesus and his disciples around a day to get to the village of Bethany. Now if we do the maths, it meant that Lazarus died shortly after the messenger left to contact Jesus. So even if Jesus had travelled immediately, Lazarus would still have been dead by a couple of days. And of course, Jesus knew that. Although we are not told as such, I imagine that Martha and Mary sent the message to Jesus because they were hoping for Jesus to come and heal Lazarus. They also knew from past experience that Jesus didn't even need to be physically with Lazarus for him to be healed. On another occasion, Jesus healed a centurion's servant by just saying the word. But Jesus didn't do what they'd hoped for. All he said about Lazarus' sickness, that it would not end in death, and that God's Son would be glorified through it. Now I can imagine the sister saying, well, how on earth does that work? He's already dead. There are times when I struggle to understand why God allows certain things to happen. You might be the same. We simply don't get it. That's because we see things from an earthly viewpoint when God might have something greater and more glorious in mind. There was a purpose beyond these events, although it must be said that it is far easier for us to understand what Jesus' words mean in the light of what we know actually happened than it would have been for Martha or Mary at the time. But let's read on. In verse 21, when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask." In Martha, I see incredible faith. Firstly, she says, "If you had been here, my brother would not have died." That is, Jesus, I believe you have the power over disease. I've seen you do it many times before, give sight to the blind, speech to the dumb, cleansing to the leprous, mobility to the crippled. But her faith goes even higher than that. She says, "But even now, God will give you whatever you ask." What incredible faith that is. But I also hear a gentle rebuke in her words. "If you had been here." Maybe she was saying that if you'd come quicker, if you'd changed your travel plans, if you'd not delayed. But then again, I might be being a little bit harsh on Martha there. Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again at the resurrection on the last day." The resurrection of the body is an important belief in both the Jewish and Christian faiths, and Martha was being perfectly orthodox in what she said. Yes, I know he'll rise again. Basically, she was saying that, I know that death is not the end. And then Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die." "Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." Let us not forget that the reason that John wrote his gospel was to help us see that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing in him we should have life, which gives us a clue as to why John decided to include this story in his gospel, a story which incidentally Matthew, Mark and Luke choose not to include. John continues, verse 32. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Those words sound familiar. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. John chapter 11 verse 35 is the shortest verse in the Bible, just 2 words. Jesus wept. Yet those words speak so deeply into our hearts. There have been many chapters of books and academic papers written just on those 2 words. People have asked, why should Jesus weep? As he was soon to turn Martha and Mary's grieving into rejoicing. Well, I admit it's not easy to answer those questions, but it does seem to say something really important to us. That is, Jesus entered into the grief of those who were mourning. He came alongside them and sat where they sat, felt their pain and grief, and was empathetic to their loss. Those 2 words, Jesus wept, tell us that Jesus is the one who walks with us through the valley of the shadow of death, and we fear no evil because he is with us. He is with us in our despair, in our discouragement. He is with us ultimately in death. Nothing can separate us from his love. Speaking of Jesus, the writer of Hebrews says that he is the one who understands our weaknesses, for he faced all the same testings as we do. The following verse then adds, "So let us come boldly to the throne of our gracious God. There we will receive his mercy, and we will find grace to help us when we need it most." What a wonderful, wonderful promise that is. I am so grateful that Jesus understands how I feel, how I think, my trials, my emotions, my desires, my temptations, because he experienced them too. Too often Christians have thought of Jesus more in terms of a kind of stained glass window figure with a halo around his head, looking piously down on the world, as if he has no real idea of the trouble and the trials and the tribulations of that humans face. Well, of course, that's not true. Jesus was born a Jew, a nation that had been under slavery for the best part of 600 years. The legitimacy of his birth was doubted. Rumours abounded throughout his life. He experienced the hate and condemnation of religious authorities who sought to eliminate him. He was betrayed by his dearest friends. He was indicted on false charges, tried before a prejudiced jury, convicted by a cowardly judge. He was tortured and executed in the most humiliating, degrading way with common thieves. He was forsaken and abandoned by all. Therefore, I think he is more than qualified to come alongside us in the trials and traumas of life. Verse 38 says, Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odour, for he has been there for 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." Jesus' delay wasn't a denial. The reason Jesus delayed coming to Lazarus was that a greater miracle than healing a sick man would occur. It was a miracle of resurrection, and greater still, of a man who had been dead for 4 days. Now, there was an old Jewish tradition that says that for 3 days a person's spirit hovers around the tomb, but then abandons the body. Now, I'm not saying for a moment that we should believe that, but they believed that. But since it had now been 4 days since the death of Lazarus, all those present believed that there was no hope at all for him. So Jesus, and for him to raise someone who's been dead 4 days, was a miracle that was simply in a different league of miracles. Mary, Martha, the disciples, none of them at the time could really understand why Jesus delayed his journey. But with God, delay isn't necessarily a denial. There are times in our own lives when we might question, why hasn't God answered our prayers in our time in a way that we expected, and we are left confused and perhaps slightly disillusioned or discouraged. But let us remember that God's delays might well be for reasons that we cannot yet see, but by God's grace we might understand them in a later time. Verse 43, when he had said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth." The dead man came out, his hands and his feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Oh, I would have so loved to have been there. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." One commentator rather quaintly wrote that Jesus needed to be specific by saying, "Lazarus, come out," or there would have been a mass resurrection in the graveyard. That comment made me smile. Often in John's Gospel we find great stories that are used by Jesus as a kind of visual aid for him to teach his hearers some deeper spiritual truths. For example, Jesus used the story of feeding the 5,000 to teach his disciples that he was the bread of life. And he used the account of Jesus healing a man born blind, essentially bringing light into his darkness, to illustrate that he was the light of the world. And on another occasion, he uses the story of Lazarus rising from the dead to illustrate the deeper truth that he is the resurrection and the life. Essentially, Jesus is saying that death does not have the final word. The final word belongs to him. He is the one who says, "I am the resurrection and the life." There are 3 significant questions that confront every person. The first is, who am I? Which is a question of identity. The second one is, why am I here? Which is a question of purpose. And the third one is, where am I going? Which is a question of eternity. Three humongous questions. Questions that we all need to answer for ourselves. And it's the third of these questions, the question of eternity, that Jesus addresses in this passage. He makes an astounding claim that eternity, life beyond this life, is linked with what we think of him. It's an incredible claim. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die, said Jesus. Just catch that. Incidentally, the word believe doesn't just mean a simple acknowledgement of the fact. Jesus was speaking of a trust, of committing oneself to him. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. If I'd been giving this talk 6 months ago, I would have said that we live in a world where science has virtually eliminated disease that once were killers, tuberculosis, polio, diphtheria, smallpox. Thanks to medical science, we live older now than we used to. But then comes along coronavirus and it changes everything. Each day we have updates on the news on how many people have died with COVID-19 on that day and what the cumulative totals are worldwide. 6 months ago, I would have probably said that death was more of a taboo subject, the kind of subject that you don't talk about in polite company, the great unmentionable. But the awful reality of this pandemic has caused many people to talk about death more realistically and perhaps ask questions, the big questions. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? And is there more to this life than the physical material world that I experience? Is there a life after this life? Now, these questions, of course, are not new. They're questions that people have asked down through the centuries. But these questions seem to have a greater poignancy in our present circumstances, where death is perhaps more real to us all. Let me come to my conclusion. Jesus revealed himself as the resurrection and the life to Martha, but he also asked her for a response. Listen again to what Jesus said to her. He said, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die." Do you believe this? Do you believe this? There must always be a response. Just as Jesus asked Martha, he is asking us today, do you believe this? Martha answered, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who has come into the world." Actually, she gave her answer even before Jesus performed the miracle. But what is our answer to that question? It's interesting to note that there were different answers among those who witnessed the miracle. John tells us that many of the Jews had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did, put their faith in him. To me, that seems a natural response. If I had been there and saw a dead man being brought back to life as Lazarus was, then I too would have put my faith in Jesus. I can't believe that I would have done otherwise. But John also tells us of a second group. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. They wanted a second opinion. You could say that they were agnostics, that don't know us. My mind isn't really fully made up. They were indecisive. I need to run this by some others first. But there was a third group, the Jewish High Council, the Sanhedrin, whose response was quite breathtaking. They said, "Here is this man performing many miraculous signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him." They didn't deny the miracle, but they were conscious that this miracle worker Jesus could make things very difficult for them with the ruling overlords, the Romans. They feared that Jesus was a revolutionary who could cause an uprising and bring the wrath of the Romans upon their nation. They didn't deny, what Jesus had done, but they were hard and prejudiced against him. Their minds were closed. Varied responses. Some had faith and trusted in Jesus. Some were unsure. You could say they were agnostics. Still others were hardened and prejudiced. I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? What we have there is the most important of all statements, followed by the most important of all questions. It's a question that we need to answer for ourselves. Shall we pray together? Dear Lord, we thank you for the way that you revealed your true humanity by weeping alongside Mary and Martha. We thank you that you remain the one who is deeply touched by our own trials and tribulations, the one who knows what life is truly like, the one who sat where we sit. We thank you that you are our compassionate friend, our counselor, our guide. We also thank you that you are deity. We thank you for your godness. As you revealed in this passage, you are the resurrection and the life, the one with power over life and death. Grant us faith, Lord, and confidence in your power and love. Enable us to entrust our lives and our eternity into your safekeeping. Amen.
Welcome to ALSA,